This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Rebel Speak, a Justice Movement mixtape by Breon Bain. Rebel Speak sounds the alarm for a global movement to end systemic injustice, led by people doing the day-to-day rebel work in the prison capital of the world. Prison activist, artist, and scholar Breon Bain brings us transformative oral history ciphers rooted in the tradition of call and response to lay bare the struggle and sacrifice on the front lines of the fight to abolish the prison industrial complex. Breon invites us to join conversations with changemakers whose diverse critical perspectives and firsthand accounts expose the crisis of prisons and policing. Sampling his provocative sessions with influential artists and culture workers, Breon guides discussions about the power of art and activism to build solidarity and demand justice. Rebel Speak by Breon Bain, out now from University of California Press. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. We on the left think a lot about the rise of the West. As Marx put it, it was, quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins that signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. But what if to understand the rise of the West, we must first understand the empires and world orders based in the East that dominated from the 13th century onward. Empires that only decisively fell behind the West in material terms with the Industrial Revolution. My guest today is Ayşe Zarakol, and we're discussing her phenomenal new book, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. Many continue, as Zarakol writes, to, quote, date both the emergence of state sovereignty and of an international system to the Westphalian Peace of 1648. Instead, she looks back to the 13th century and the rise of Genghis Khan, whose family over 3 generations conquered much of modern Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Russia. This Chinggisid Empire and then empires eventually gave way to 2 post-Chinggisid empires, comprising what Zarakol calls the post-Chinggisid world order. Timur or Tamerlane, whose empire stretched from Delhi up to Afghanistan and Central Asia through Persia, Baghdad, the Levant, and Tbilisi, and also in China, the Ming Dynasty, which under its earlier emperors was profoundly influenced by the Mongol Yuan dynasty they had supplanted. Then came the post-Timurid world order, comprising the vast Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. The Ottomans at their height controlled large swaths of the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. The Safavids at their peak controlled large parts of Persia, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. And the Mughals ruled over the Indian subcontinent and parts of Afghanistan. What connects them all over the centuries is a particular model of sovereignty that concentrated all the power in the hands of the ruler, a sovereignty that was legitimated through conquest. As we look at the crises hitting the world system today, both domestically and globally, Zarakol's book shows us why we must broaden our vision of what a world system or world order is, and what it means for one to collapse. What makes Dig interviews different, I think, is that I have a lot of time to read books extremely closely, and then spend a lot of time formulating questions that I think will bring that book's ideas and arguments to you, the listeners, and into conversation with other books and other ideas. My secret, in short, is just extremely intensive preparation. I can only afford to spend that sort of time on the podcast because I have the good fortune to do this for a full-time job. And that's only possible because those of you listeners who can afford to support us do so at patreon.com/thedig. And as if us just making this wonderful podcast for you, as if that were not a good enough reason for you to contribute, we also throw in some very nice gifts. A contribution of any size at all, even $1 a month, that gets you access to our excellent weekly email newsletter. Contributions of $10 or more a month, and we will send you a book or books, a Dig tote bag, or a Dig mug in the mail. Please contribute what you can. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Ayşe Zarakol, a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at Emmanuel College. She is the author of After Defeat: How the East Learned to Live with the West, and her new book that we're discussing today, Before the West: The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. Ayşe Zarakol, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
You write, quote, "Our modern international order, which emerged in the 19th century, has been made possible by the rise of the West. And it is Europe, the West, that has occupied its core seat of privilege for the last 2 centuries. Not only has this fact continuously shaped our politics in the present, but it has distorted our understanding of world political history and thus also our theories about international politics. Many have invariably read the conclusion of the story back into that history." To start off, why is it important to understand the history of these world orders that for centuries were dominated by Asian empires? To look at the East, not only to explain the West, but also in its own right. Why is it important not only for the purpose of getting the history right, but also to better understand our present world order at a time of compounding crisis?
Thank you. I mean, it's a big question, but in some ways it is the central question of the book. Essentially, I mean, my argument is everybody's talking about, the decline of the West, or maybe decline of the US, the decline of the liberal international order. These decline debates are very alive in the moment. And often people try to think historically when they try to make sense of what's going on now. But the examples most people in these contemporary debates work with are rather cliche. I mean, it's usually like Rome or maybe the British Empire. So I thought it would be worthwhile. I mean, my goal was always to write the history of the East for international relations, but I thought it would be also worthwhile to do that because it expands our current thinking. There were these historical world orders in Asia that we've almost completely forgotten about, and that, that maybe puts the current debate in a different perspective, because it's very hard for those of us who've been shaped by the modern international order to even imagine that the West, the centrality of the West, could one day be forgotten. But the East was very central for centuries, and it's been written out of its own history almost. So if it happened in the East, it could happen in the West as well. And that's a different story than, right, what happened with maybe Rome, or how that historiography is told.
You contrast the story and mythos surrounding Marco Polo with that of Ibn Battuta, a really remarkable 14th century world traveler from Tangier, to illustrate just the enormity and interconnectedness of Eastern world orders, and also the way that Western myth-making has obscured that all. Quote, "When we start filling out the space around the popular image of Marco Polo as bravely going where no man had ever gone before, with examples of other travelers who traveled all the way from China to Europe, or from Morocco all the way to China, the world of the 13th and 14th centuries surprises us. It is a world that is much more connected than we would expect, with well-established overland and naval routes. Importantly, it was the Chinggisid Empire founded by Genghis Khan and its successor empires that made Asia this cohesive place, you write, not the later encounter with European colonialism. And that happened not just through political unification, but also because of trade and the circulation of ideas, experts, artists, and even occult scientists. What is revealed that's otherwise obscured? when we see Polo as a visitor from the periphery to the center of a vast cosmopolitan world order with hugely expansive postal, trade, and governance systems.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to do in the book is, what I was trying to do is to kind of decenter, I mean, to use this nowadays fashionable term, decenter Europe and European actors and West and Western actors. Not that they're not important or their stories are not worth telling, but for a long time we've been telling only their stories. You know, there are other stories to be to be told. I mean, I grew up in Turkey, but I was exposed to the same, idea of Marco Polo. I had this idea that, when you see stuff that's especially prepared for children, it's like this idea of Marco Polo, almost like going to to Mars or something, like a place that nobody had really visited, and he was like the first, I mean, I'm not even sure, I didn't go back and check, I'm not even sure these things are claimed explicitly, but our imagination kind of fills in the blanks as him being this great adventurer. But then when you discover the real history of these places, he's one among many, 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 many travelers. And then it's suddenly your sense of how Asia is and used to be, changes. Because if it was so connected in the 13th century that so many people could move around, I'd recommend to the readers, to the listeners, to pick up, the memoirs of Ibn Battuta. They are available. Actually, you can, they've been translated. It's a good read. And he's moving around from North Africa to, across Asia. He lives in many places he visits. Nobody is really surprised by him. Everybody kind of, I mean, that's what's remarkable, right?
This sort of like easy cosmopolitanism.
Yes, and they ask him from his hosts ask him about where he's been, but it's clear that they already have some kind of prior knowledge of these places, so they are getting updates from him, and he's able to settle in different places and kind of do his job. He's a jurist. I mean, when I was reading that, initially I wasn't actually going to write about him. I was just reading stuff from the period for texture, for my own thinking. And then I thought, I mean, this is a kind of a person like me. I mean, I grew up in Turkey, as I said, and then I moved to the US. Now I live in the UK. And I mean, it hasn't been amazingly easy, but it hasn't been difficult because I have the same reference and I can talk to people. I have, we've probably watched similar TV shows growing up and so on. So it's not like a huge culture shock. It's relatively easy in our world to move from one place to another, because we say it's so globalized, right? But the 13th century was also globalized and connected. So that's where I start the story, because I want the readers to have the sense of the real history of Asia or the East as a connected place, which was then fragmented. And when, Europeans took over, they were kind of building over, I mean, in 18th, 19th century on what already existed, which was a very connected space.
Your book traces the continuity of the Chinggisid sovereignty model in shaping the world's most consequential empires from the 13th century, and they last into the early 20th century when the Ottoman Empire finally comes to an end. Quote, "The Chinggisid model, or ideal type, was marked by the extreme centralization of power and authority in the person of the great Khan, the supreme ruler. As with Genghis Khan, Chinggisid sovereigns did not share authority with any others. They claimed lawmaking power above and beyond that of religious and other actors." What was distinct and new about this sovereignty model compared to others that had prevailed previously or that prevailed elsewhere in the world at the time?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure it's entirely novel. It's possible that it has versions of this existed elsewhere in other time periods. I don't know, maybe ancient Egypt or something. But I mean, in its particular manifestation, it's unique. And what makes the Chinggisid model unique is this extreme centralization, as I call it, claiming, all this authority in one person. And even though, we tend to think of history as, history of monarchs and, kings and, other types of rulers that we would call, autocracy today, actually, a king or somebody like a king claiming all power for himself, it's not that common. In most arrangements, there is some kind of sharing of authority, usually with religious authority, or some kind of claim that the king's power comes from some type of divine right or some kind of religious mandate. What I thought was unique in the Chinggisid model. Again, there are precursors to this also in Asia. I mean, so it's this, Genghis Khan gives this his particular spin. What's unique about the model is Genghis Khan is, the great Khan. He's the lawmaker, and he's not the lawmaker because he's a prophet or he's consulted with, jurists or he has the backing of a church or something like that. He's a lawmaker because he's a world conqueror. He has the heavens mandate. But heaven is not like paradise. It's not some kind of, it's a very vaguely almost, it's a shamanistic, this notion of heaven as like the sky above. So if you're, as a ruler, you can kind of match that on earth.
It's more like astronomical or astrological.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more like an empirical sense of sky. So if you can empirically, in practice, match the sky in the world, by creating a world empire, a universal empire, then you have. I mean, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you have all the authority? You can make all the laws, and everybody has to obey. I mean, if it's not entirely unique, it's certainly rare, that degree of authority in one person. And of course, in his person, in Genghis Khan's person, it's a very successful. There's. Because he does come very close to conquering all of the known world at the time. And, even today, the idea of a country like Russia that spans most of Eurasia, I mean, that's difficult to run. Imagine in 13th century, something of that size and even beyond. So that example of, the going from relatively humble beginnings with a caveat. I mean, he wasn't exactly, a nobody. He did come from aristocratic lineage, so he did have the right to, what he claimed in that particular universe. But then he's able to, go from not having much power at all to ruling over most of Eurasia. So then his example becomes very, very powerful for other rulers, down the line who want to attempt similar things. So then it becomes like this model that influences empire building in Asia and Eurasia. And, there are other historical figures like him, I suppose, like Alexander and others that have played on the imaginations of empire builders. So the story was very influential, but at the same time, the empire created its own institutions. It's ruled over, as I said, a very large area for a long time. And then, of course, if over a century. And if you're exposed to something for over a century, you're shaped by it. So, even if you're emerging from out of that empire, the things that you're going to do will be probably a version of what you experienced, or maybe a reaction to what you experienced. But the influence is palpable even after the empire.
Yeah, before we talk more about the sovereignty model, let's lay out just some of that concrete history. In the early 13th century, Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, consolidated power among various Mongol houses. He and then his son, Ogedei, conquered present-day Iran, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Russia, much of China, defeating forces as far west as Hungary and Poland. And then his grandson, Ming Khan, conquered the rest of China alongside his brother Kublai. Meanwhile, another brother, Hulagu, took Baghdad and killed the last Abbasid caliph and took Aleppo and Damascus, only to finally be defeated by the Mamluk dynasty of Egypt. It's a really incredible story. How over 3 generations did this house from the steppe manage to conquer so much of the world?
I mean, they were ambitious. They, for reasons I explained, because they had this, expansive vision of, of the world and, what they were meant to do. I guess they felt entitled to it. So, I mean, I that's the mindset. At the same time, I think they had certain, military advantages and strategies. There is some, debate nowadays because discussions of climate change have become popular among historians. The effects of climate change. There's a theory that this was a particularly wet period, which made grassland more readily available for the horses and made it easier for. So that may be why then. Also, I mean, I think it's a moment, 13th century. I mean, there aren't really big forces opposing them. The relatively politically fragmented moment across Eurasia, as you said, probably in addition to China, Persia is, or the Middle East, what we call the Middle East. These are the two centers of gravity, but both are not in a great state politically. The Caliph was very weak at the time, so it's also the fact that probably there weren't other great houses to really successfully resist them. Yeah, so it's probably a combination of factors of how or why they were able to do it.
You write, quote, "The great Khan had to be a world conqueror. In the Chingisid model, extreme centralization of political authority was intimately linked with the notion of universal sovereignty. The two went together, and this is why the Chingisid model started destabilizing when conquests stopped. And then Chingisid empires also managed succession through what was called, quote, tanistry, a way of handling succession that is different from the primogeniture model more common in European monarchies. In tanistry, members of the ruling house are all eligible to inherit, but there is no established order of succession. Sometimes the ruler designates as an heir before their own death, but even that is not necessarily obeyed. Typically, then, in the Chingisid model, brothers and other relatives would fight each other to the death to claim sovereignty. How did tanistry complement conquest to support Chingisid sovereign legitimacy? And what sort of problems did the eventual inability to permanently continue conquest, because you either run out of space or suffer defeat or whatever, and B, this really bloody and messy secession practice, what sort of problems did each of those two forms of legitimation pose for the stability of those ruling houses?
Yeah, great question. The idea of tanistry is linked to this need for world conquest. I mean, because the Khan, the great Khan in this model, the Chingisid sovereign, is claiming all this authority. As I said, he has to legitimize, why should he have all this power? It's because he's a world conqueror, right? And then how can we kind of make sure that the person ruling is going to be a world conqueror? I think, the tanistry model comes out of that, because if you just pick the oldest son, there's no guarantee that he has the natural ability to be a great conqueror. But if you kind of make everybody fight for the throne, then essentially the eligible person who conquers all of their siblings and uncles and so on, they've already come to power by conquest. I mean, to our mind, that this is like, very to modernize. It makes it looks disorderly. It seems bloody and violent, and of course, in practice, it was terrible. I mean, it's fratricide, all sorts of all the way to the Ottomans, to the Mughals. They used these types of practices, but there was a logic to it because it's essentially you're selecting for the person who has the ability to function in this way that maybe is the best guarantor that they will also go on to conquer outside of the family once they're in power. So I think that was the logic of tanistry. So this is why we see a close association not just with the Mongol Empire but in the successor states. to the extent the successor states are influenced by this original model, they're still practicing tenestry, either formally or informally. They think this is okay. So it's a kind of a secondary institution associated with this particular understanding of sovereignty. But as you said, both caused problems in practice. Tenestry caused problems because it created interregnum periods. So, in the original, in Genghis Khan's empire, in the Mongol Empire, every time the ruler passed, there was almost every time. There were first of all, anybody who could throw their hat in the ring, had to come back from like long distances, and then there were years before this succession issue was settled. Civil wars, but in later successor states too, sometimes the tenestry idea caused succession crises. It caused the fragmentation of some of the successor states. So in practice, it was a problem. The silver lining is, in the I don't talk about this much in the book, but in the Mongol Empire, but also maybe in the successor states, you have women ruling. Like often the interregnum periods is a moment where the wife of the Khan, becomes essentially a de facto ruler, and that's also very interesting. What seems to be a very patriarchal is maybe not the right word, but male-dominated kind of system in these moments of interregnum and so on falls at the mercy of the women in the system to keep things going. So that's one angle of problem. The other issue was, as you said, conquest. It's kind of built into the legitimacy of this type of empire. They had to, they were all claiming to be universal empires. So the moment, they can't conquer anymore, or they have to kind of exist a de facto existence with another empire that's claiming the same, there is a contradiction. How can there be two universal empires? But in practice, there have to be, because often it's more beneficial for trade, or, you can't keep fighting, it's expensive to wage these wars. So these types of rulers ended up looking for alternative ways of legitimating their rule. They ended up converting to certain, local religions, often Islam, but getting Sinicized in China. So alternative modes of legitimation. And that creates very interesting hybrid forms, but often spells the end of, the Chinggizid model, increased bureaucratization. Yeah, so there was almost an expiry date built into this type of empire building, because it's difficult to pull off in practice.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the external limits that propelled this contradiction, but it's a contradiction that emerged even within the Chinggisid world order when Genghis Khan's empire ultimately fractures into four distinct khanates. The Jochid Khanate, or Golden Horde, ruling Russia, the Chagatai Khanate, ruling Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate, covering Iran and the Middle East. Again, all these words I'm using are for the facility of listeners understanding what geographically I'm speaking about. And then the Yuan Khanate, or dynasty, in China. How did the empire end up breaking up into these four parts, and what impact did that fracturing have on their ability to perpetuate empire and imperial legitimacy? You write, quote, "If there are four Khans, the implication is that there is not a great Khan." How did they attempt to reconcile that contradiction, and why, amid what is known as the general crisis of the 14th century, did they fail with all of the successor Khanates, ultimately all but the Golden Horde, losing power?
Originally the empire was centered in Inner Asia, or what we call Central Asia now. Once China is fully conquered, the center of gravity kind of gets pulled there, of course, because China is the old civilization, very prosperous.
It's a big deal to be in charge of China.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So the essentially what we call the Yuan dynasty is, the lineage of the Great Khan is supposed to be there. But as they settle into ruling China, and there are all these, of course, as we discussed, there are these succession battles in which lines are drawn, one brother supporting the other brother. And so there are all these resentments from these interregnum periods between the different lineages of the family. And it was also, their practice to, because it's such a vast territory to rule over, it was their practice to distribute areas under, particular brothers. So the divisions of the Genghis branches were built into, the administrative structure of the empire, even when it was unified. So increasingly, these different bits, as you called the Jochid and the Chagatai and the Ilkhanate, they become essentially de facto independent of the Great Khanate, which is the Yuan dynasty. And then they're fighting each other before this autonomy is recognized, but then they settle into kind of a period of peace, which creates this internal contradiction, as we discussed, because there are in practice, four khans of almost, well, at least the Chagatai Khanate is weaker, but, of similar or comparable, power. But it's good for trade. This is the period of, Pax Mongolica. The fact that they're not fighting each other means the connections that they had established. There, as I discuss in the book, there was this postal system and essentially, facilitation of, trade across these territories, so that can continue if they're no longer, fighting each other. So that's, essentially what the original Mongol world order or the Chinggizid world order, settles into in the 14th century. What causes that particular arrangement to fragment or collapse? Again, it's debatable, but some historians, as I discuss in the book, talk about a 14th century crisis. From European history, many people will know that this is a troubled period. There is disease spreading. Again, there are different theories as to what exactly the root of spread was. But we do know that, it affected, at least, for instance, the Ilkhanate, that line ends. And and then there are other troubles, financial and other. So that's kind of a running theme in the book. When you look at history in this longue durée, it becomes apparent that it's not necessarily like particular things particular rulers did. But it's more, there are these bigger patterns, different states or empires or houses, as I call them, seem to run into trouble around the same time, which suggests to me that there are things that are beyond, political choices of particular rulers. And so I think that's maybe what's happening in this midpoint in the 14th century, like structural pressures that caused the real fragmentation of this world order.
Why did each of the successor khanates become more religious than Genghis Khan's larger empire had been? And in what way did these empires become more religious, given that while Genghis Khan ejected the shaman from office, his claim of the mandate of heaven was also so critical to his legitimacy? And we touched on this a bit earlier, but I guess more specifically, how did the role played by astronomy, astrology, and other forms of occult sciences in legitimating Chinggisid sovereignty compare to religious forms of legitimating sovereignty? Buddhism in the case of the Yuan dynasty, and Islam in the case of the Jochid, Chagatai, and Ilkhanate.
Yeah, so as I said, as these successor khanates have to exist in the world, and they're no longer expanding and they kind of have to coexist together, they start looking for alternative modes of legitimation, I think. And the issue is, the issue is always, how do you get people you're ruling over or governing over accept your authority? And as I've said before, one time-tested way is religion. If you share, a religion of your subjects, or even if you don't, but you are recognized by particular religious authorities as having authority, that's a great aid in legitimizing sovereignty, or has been historically. Of course, there may have been political reasons, personal reasons, as well. Maybe they were initially, like Genghis Khan and his family, they used to have representatives of different religions come and debate in Karakorum, which was the capital for like their entertainment. So that's going on. Yeah, so the Western Khanates convert to Islam. Interestingly, Golden Horde, what comes to be called the Golden Horde, the Joshid Dynasty, or Joshid Khanate. They should all be called Khanates. That's what's also interesting about historiography. We call them different things, which makes them seem like different things, but they were actually originally, four of the same thing. They also convert to Islam, even though they are in northern steppes, the area we call Russia, and taxing cities of Rus. So they don't convert to Christianity, but that may be also because when the Mongols are operating like this empire, 13th, 14th century, again, the two centers of civilization would be like China and the Middle East. Europe was very peripheral. Christianity was peripheral. it didn't, there wasn't much of an argument for it. Maybe that's also probably part of it, and that so temporarily solves their problem of legitimation, at least in some realms. But it also creates other problems, because there's a contradiction between the Chinggizid model and Islam. In Islam, universal sovereign is Allah. It's not Genghis Khan. Like, so how do you reconcile a particular understanding of sovereignty that puts all the power in the ruler on earth with a worldview that essentially puts it elsewhere, in the beyond. And of course, it's a big shock for Islamic societies as well, because Islamic societies had evolved their own version of separation of church and state. Before the Mongols came over, political rulers were not that powerful. They didn't make laws. The ulama, especially if we're talking about the Sunni side of it, the ulama, like the Islamic jurists, they interpreted Quran. They made essentially jurisprudence. The ruler was like the sword, the defender of like society, but they didn't have internal that much authority. Like, they had to always kind of consult. And then there was also the caliph, so it was like a three-way division. Authority wasn't centralized. Suddenly you have this Mongol model where the Khan says, I'm Muslim, but I'm still making all the laws. And how do you like reconcile that with the idea that in Islam, Sharia, it's supposed to be the Quran and the way it's interpreted, that people are supposed to get their ideas of what the law is. So that creates an issue that way. And also of course, China it has its own checks on this type of centralized authority. So there are issues there as well.
Timur, you write, combined various legitimacy models: Chinggisid, Persianate, Islamic, and Sufi messianism. Quote, he was building on the Khanate experiment of hybrid legitimation of sovereignty. Say a little bit more about how did he gather all these threads to embody this position, identity, role of Sahib Kiran, Lord of Conjunction, and what was being conjoined in that there?
So, the conjunction is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is... so it was considered, another one happened, I think, recently. I can't remember exactly when, but in the book I had made a note of it. I think it was in 2020, marking, as they believe, the beginning and the ends of time, also great events and great man. And this idea becomes really elevated and attached to, as I said, it's an idea that's, in the culture, but it really becomes attached to Timur. Timur is, is very ambitious. He's not from the Chinggizid house, so he has a problem with pedigree. But he does remodel himself, remake himself in the image of Genghis Khan. He like deliberately follows his, life story, marries a Chinggisid woman, so he wants to be a Chinggisid sovereign. That's the way I define it. And he's definitely, playing up that image. At the same time, he's existing in a world where he can't fully claim that. So he's using other ways of legitimizing his empire. The empire is building by conquest. And at this point already, like all the lineages, like the different like houses of the Mongols most of them had converted to Islam anyway. So he kind of has to operate within that milieu. And this is West Central Asia. So it's, it's the Persianate world, there are, Persian notions of kingship. All of this is kind of percolating. And of course, these Sufi ideas of messianism. So all of that is there. And you kind of work with what you have. And he's very successful at that. And as I said, I think this astrological story is what kind of ties all of it together. Because it's cutting across different understandings of empire, kingship, sovereignty. It's like their common language. I mean, astrology, it seems silly, like because we think of astrology today as, like, do you read your horoscope, like on the internet? I mean, a lot of people do, but I think very few people like really believe it. But in that world, it's quasi-scientific, it's not like, there are no horoscopes. It's more, there are these people who study, star charts, and I think I like to say they're kind of like the political scientists of their day, because they have like, quasi-scientific language, and they make predictions, and, you were born close to a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, therefore, of course, you were destined to be a ruler. But of course, it's a bit imprecise, like how close, how close were you born, right? There's
a bit imprecise, like much of contemporary political science.
Yeah, like it's like polling or something. You can kind of make it sound the way you like, but it's this, because it doesn't belong to a particular religion or particular culture. I think it becomes the glue that kind of ties all these different experiments of authority building together.
The fall of these four Genghis descendant empires in the 14th century and the rise of the Timurid Empire, which, just to clarify for listeners, stretches from Delhi up to Afghanistan and Central Asia through Persia, Baghdad, the Levant, and Tbilisi, just enormous. So that the Timurid Empire on the one hand, and then the Ming Dynasty in China on the other, you write that this comprises a new world order. And Timur's case, as we were just discussing, is pretty obvious. They took over much of the territory of what had been the Chagatai Khanate. Timur ruled through a Chagatai puppet Khan, and he, quote, deliberately fashioned himself after Genghis Khan. But with China, many wouldn't see that as so obvious with the Ming, which was a Han-governed dynasty, and it took over after the overthrow of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. What makes them both together constitute a new world order?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was to link, China into the bigger story of Asia or the East. Often China is studied as its own thing, as, certainly like a civilization, a continuous civilization across the ages, but not really being connected to the rest of the continent, at least beyond East Asia. In my account, what we call China is very connected to the larger story of Asia and the East, because it's first part of this Mongol empire or Chinggisid empire. Then it's part of, the four khanates who have their own kind of order. The Yuan dynasty is like the other khanates, even though it's called Yuan dynasty. And then it's overthrown by, Yuan dynasty is overthrown by the Ming. But of course, you cannot, just overthrow something and be free of its influence. I mean, this is true now. In our modern world, most states are a product of decolonization. So they've come out of, imperial periods. But they are very much shaped by that experience. They may have rejected it or, refused it and said, we're better than them or so on. But they are still, that experience is formative to how those states function today. So why would it be any different?
And you could even argue that it fundamentally constrains those states in pretty detrimental ways.
Yeah. Yes. So the same is true for the Ming. I mean, the Ming overthrew the Yuan, and they reinstituted some of the previous practices that the Yuan had done away with, but they were still, at least the early Ming emperors, were their understanding of like how a ruler functions. They had the examples of the Yuan, right? So they couldn't but think of the world in those terms, even as they, rejected them. So the early Ming, I argue, were very much under the influence of the Chinggisid sovereignty model. So with Hongwu and Yongle emperors, you see like this, very centralized, like autocratic, as it would be called, very powerful emperors who are very interested in, external recognition. I mean, this is the period of, the treasure voyagers, but also overlooked now. There were all these overland overtures, embassies. For Han Chinese emperors, they were very interested in getting to be recognized by the rest of Asia as, the great emperors. And that interest comes from this Chinggisid model, because Chinggisid model is, as we discussed, is very external looking. It wants to be recognized as the Chinggisid rulers have to be world conquerors, world emperors, universal sovereigns. So we see that in the early Ming Dynasty until they turn inward and the influence of Confucianism increases, for various reasons that I discuss. Until around mid 15th century, the early Ming are acting, even if they don't admit it, they are acting like Chinggisid sovereigns, and that puts them in this competition with the Timurid on the other side of Asia. So the Timurid are expansionists, the Timurid Empire, especially, Timur, he wants to conquer China because the Chinggisids did. So he dies on the way to China. Initially, it seems like they will, they're both, in a way, expansionary. They could have had history gone a different way. They could have fought each other, but they don't. So they settle into this kind of coexistence with a shared understanding of how the world works, and they both care very much about what's happening in Inner Asia, this trade route. Again, that's, contrary to what we think today. It seems, because Central Asia is relatively insignificant today, many people who write like Chinese history, like at least in international relations, assume that China was never interested in, Inner Asia. But actually, this was like their primary preoccupation, the early Ming too, because again, this is where the activity was. And this is, kind of the middle belt between the Timurids and the early Ming, and there's still a lot of houses in that space with their own ambitions and their own, everybody's kind of participated in this shared world, both, in terms of trade, but also how they understand like the world to be. Yeah, so I argued that this was a relatively short-lived, compared to some of the others I look at, but still very much a world order. Kind of like the US and the Soviet Union, the Cold War period. I think that's how I like to think of these two. We wouldn't say the Cold War was insignificant just because it lasted less than a century. It was very significant in its own way.
This post-Chinggisid world order came to an end in the mid-15th century with, on the one hand, the disintegration of the Timurid Empire, and then also later Ming emperors turn inward and toward Neo-Confucianism. What was it about this period? What happened that not only impacted the Timurid and Ming empires the way that it did, but also saw the Byzantine Empire fall to the Ottomans, the Golden Horde to fall to Muscovy under Ivan III, and the Delhi Sultanate falling to the Pashtuns, and the rival Turkoman confederations that had ruled Persia increasingly losing out to the Sufi order of the Safaviya. What brought an end not only to this post-Chinggisid world order, but really to ruling powers all over the place?
Yeah, here we hit another, a crisis period, as some historians call it. If you only look at, Chinese history or the Timurid history, it looks like, also nationalized histories. We tell stories of this ruler made these mistakes or made the decision to turn inward and so on. But when you put the whole picture together, then you see that there are problems everywhere, right? So what seems to be personal conscious decisions of particular rulers ends up being part of a bigger pattern. So in this period, in the 15th century, West Asia is in great trouble, especially. I mean, there are a lot of dynastic changes, and the Ming turn inward, as you said. I mean, this is often blamed on there's this incident where the emperor is captured, and then it creates kind of this trauma, the Tumi incident. But I don't think that's that's maybe a turning point, but I think something is bigger is going on. I mean, some possible explanations, again, climate change, coin shortage. I mean, whatever the reason, there seems to have been a disruption of a trade across Asia, with greater, I think, impact on West Asia, because it was so dependent on West Asia was this kind of stopping point for trade, often of goods coming from China, and the West Asian polities, especially the Timurids, were great consumers of this, but they were also traders, selling to Middle East and Europe, and I think maybe that's part of it. But again, I think it's some kind of structural problem where the existing order is under, as I call it, structural pressures. And you can only see that when you put all the bits together and start looking outside of particular empires to the whole continent. Then it seems like everybody is in trouble around the same time, even if their reactions to it differ.
The fall of the Timurid order gave rise to the post-Timurid order, which was comprised of at least three great houses: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. And maybe, you say, though you don't focus on them so much, the Uzbeks as well. But you write, what connected them, however, wasn't Islam. It was a particular, again, sort of sovereignty model. You write, quote, "It is tempting to refer to Islam as a deus ex machina explanation for all this similarity. But Muslim faith on the part of the rulers and some of the subjects does not by itself constitute an explanation of anything. Instead, quote, a better term is post-Timurid empires, or empires of the Sahib Kiran, Lord of Conjunction, or chasers of millennial sovereignty." What was this new and shared sovereignty model, and how did these empires borrow from both the Timurid tradition and Islamic millenarianism to create it? And also, what was this Islamic millenarianism?
Yes, thank you. So, as the Timurid Empire fragments, it leaves in its wake a lot of people, who've been shaped by this experience. But I mean, both, the thinkers of the day, but artists, artisans, they essentially, travel to nearby. Well, sometimes create, the Mughals are a direct offshoot of the Timurids, but also, they go to, Persia, which is going to be the seat of the Safavid Empire, and they go to Anatolia. So there are people and ideas and goods, all sorts of Timurid stuff circulating in the space that's going to be essentially, the territory of these three West Asian empires. So what I was arguing in the book is, we tend to talk about these empires as Islamic empires or Islamic empires, but we don't really, also we say that, but we don't really compare them to each other. They're often, studied in their bilateral relations with Europeans. And when you put them together, what you realize is, at least in the 16th century, they were in many ways very similar. And also they were different from other Islamic polities and empires that had existed previously. So that has to be explained. I mean, so it's not enough to say, oh, these are Islamic empires, this is why they acted in this particular way, because then other Islamic empires didn't quite act, or, kingdoms didn't act.
Especially with Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid Empire in 1501. I mean, he had his legitimacy formed through a form of millenarian Shia Sufism that held that he was the Mahdi or Messiah. That's not an everyday occurrence.
No. So what I'm arguing is, they kind of took this Timurid experiment in reconciling Islam and the Chinggizid model and took it to another level. And yes, Shah Ismail is the great innovator here in the beginning of the 16th century. And others are essentially political rulers claiming religious authority, whereas he comes out of this religious movement and he claims political authority, so it's a slightly different route to it. But yeah, so they are, again, this. I mean, the key thing that I'm tracing across these centuries is this centralized rule and how it's justified, and how, whether you can see the influences of the Chinggizid model in that justification, and you can definitely see it in this case. So and the key term was, I mean, there were other terms, but the key term was the Saib Crown term, Lord of Conjunction, which was, as we discussed, associated with Timur previously, but then became something, these three empires, those three great houses, the Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Gürkani or the Mughals, what they were fighting each other over. They were all claiming to be lords of conjunction or, lords of time. And it ties into these ideas of, millennial sovereignty, as you said. And that goes back to what we discussed about astrology being this common language that's bringing all these different belief systems together. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, I mean, I think there are small conjunctions and then big ones. And, the major conjunction, I think something that repeats, supposed to repeat by millennia. It was supposed to happen, in the 16th century. It was, so Islam, had come in the 6th century, and so the 16th century was, the end of time in a way, and also the beginning of something. So they were competing with each other, these houses, to be lords at the end of time. I mean, this is starting to sound like a Doctor Who episode, but joking aside, it is really what's legitimizing these rulers who are not like previous Islamic rulers. They are claiming all this power that, as I said before, is not supposed to rest with the Sultan or, Khan, Suleiman. I talk in the chapter on these three empires, I talk about with the Ottomans, Suleiman the Magnificent. In Turkish, he's known as Suleiman the Lawgiver. And when I was when we were learning about that in school, it doesn't seem remarkable, like Suleiman the Lawgiver. Of course, why wouldn't the Sultan be the lawgiver? But he was doing something that was very unusual in an Islamic society. He was saying, I can make the laws. Not, the ulema have to listen to me, standardized, actually, religious teachings. So, and you see that with Akbar, you see that with all of them. They're claiming all this power, essentially, to tell religious figures how to interpret, the Quran. And that's you couldn't have that without the Chinggizid influence or the Timurid influence. That's at least one of the lineages there. Also, I think it's important to study them together, because there was a lot of circulation between these courts, and you have a lot of essentially the intelligentsia of the time. But they are the astrologers and the occult scientists and so on. Going from one court to another, they're writing these treatises, relatively understudied compared to like their European counterparts. But they are writing these treatises justifying why should the ruler have all this power? Why should everybody kind of do? And they are justifying with reference to, historical examples, but also, particular interpretations of religion, astrology, and so on. All of that is in the mix. So that's, studying these empires together made me see that century very differently. And then, of course, I think the Uzbeks are definitely in the mix as another, great house with similar ambitions. I didn't talk about them as much because the historiography there is a bit, because I'm essentially working from the work of historians. So it was more of a problem with, my access to resources rather than, I'm not dismissing the Uzbeks. I think they were also important, more short-lived. And then, of course, the Habsburgs come into the mix because, as I argue in the next chapter, I don't think we can make sense of what the Habsburgs were doing unless we understand, the influence of, the Ottomans and the others on the Habsburgs and their, claims of, universal sovereignty. So then the rest of the world comes into the picture as well through these West Asian post-Timurid empires.
The Ottomans made a pretty plausible claim to millennial sovereignty through just a lot of conquest. Mehmet II captured Constantinople, then Selim I defeated the Safavids in battle and also the Mamluks, conquering the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Suleiman the Magnificent, or the Lawgiver, continued to defeat the Safavids, capturing Baghdad. But then, quote, in 1555, Suleiman and the Safavid leader Tahmasp signed the Peace of Amasya, acknowledging the legitimacy of each other's dynastic and religious claims. Having failed to achieve universal sovereignty of Chinggisid or Timurid scale, Suleiman's last decade on the throne saw him embrace the pious Sunni side of his identity over millennial sovereignty. And compared to Ismail, it was harder for Tahmasp to claim a conqueror's charisma or a messianic aura. To solve this problem, Tahmasp turned to the occult sciences. And, quote, Ottoman Sunniization in this period was paralleled in the Safavid realms by a similar Shiaization. In other words, what you're writing is that the ulama gained increasing power to check the Ottoman sovereign, while the Safavids moved from Sufi millenarianism to a more orthodox Twelver Shia orthodoxy, or what we would consider a more orthodox Twelver Shia orthodoxy today, I suppose. How did a turn to religion help these empires, like their predecessors that we've discussed, retain their legitimacy in the face of frustrated world-conquering ambitions?
Yeah, it's always this, trade-off. I mean, we see it with almost all of the examples discussed in the book. As conquests stop, you have to kind of lean on other modes of legitimation. So we see this, pattern with the Ottomans and the Safavids, as you just read. That's interestingly, that's, that's a form of confessionalization, which is like studied in European history. But this is what's also happening in the Ottoman lands and also with the Safavids. And I think, it's also what's happening here is part of the larger trend, or is not disconnected. Or what's happening in Europe in reaction to the Habsburgs is not, disconnected from this story either. So they're all part of the same story. And that's, another form of, I suppose, centralization. I mean, without getting lost too much in the weeds of, the theoretical stuff in the book. But in the first chapter, I have a, typology of, what's sovereignty. And I talk about, different types of centralization. One we've already been discussing when, centralization of political authority. But another form of centralization is through homogenization of society. Because if society becomes more homogeneous, the center by definition has more power, right? Because there's like less resistance, right? It's less. So if like people are less lumpy, they're less granular, so I think by a turn to more policed forms of religion, and then kind of policing like what's kind of right behavior, wrong behavior, that's another way of governing that can again temporarily help bolster the authority of the center, but eventually that gives more power to religious figures like the ulama. So what ended up happening in the Ottoman context is we see the power of the court increasingly checked, starting at the end of 16th century, but increasingly in the 17th century, essentially what you could call Ottoman absolutism, the Chinggisid model, is increasingly checked by the ulama, because in a religious society, the ulama, by definition, have more power. I mean, but others as well. There are other centers of authority that emerge. So that's the tension. You can lean on religion to solve your temporary lack of conquest problem, but that creates its own, forms of resistance.
It's fascinating, this inverse relationship between centralized sovereignty in the hands of the sovereign, the sultan, whatever, on the one hand, and religious homogenization on the other. So at the height of Mughal centralized power, likewise, there's more religious pluralism. You write, quote, "True to Chinggisid influences, Akbar encouraged debate among scholars of different faiths, founding in 1575 the House of Worship, where he allowed," and you're quoting someone else here, "allowed free-ranging discussion on all points of doctrine and metaphysics, not accepting even the most central tenets of Islam, sitting himself as lone spectator, referee, and judge. When this approach caused controversy and religious edicts were issued against him, he put at least 2 Muslim jurists to death, clearly asserting his authority over them." We tend to think of a sort of authoritarian government as one that would repress religious difference, but in these cases, the sort of more authoritarian the government, the more tolerance and even encouragement of religious pluralism.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the things that's different about the Chinggisid model, which I think that's why it's different from just, garden variety kingship. Because, yes, all the power is in this one person, extremely centralized, which means, religions don't have power. Even when they convert, they don't really, they're still saying, I'm the sovereign. So as a result, they were relatively uninterested in, unless, again, they started to give up on this model. Chinggisid sovereigns or post-Chinggisid, Timurid, post-Timurid sovereigns were uninterested in repressing heterodox religious practice, or they didn't mind. Some of them were interested, having debates. They thought it was amusing, but they didn't really care, what their subjects practiced, because they knew they were above it all, right? It comes from a sense of superiority. They don't think the subjects have any relation to them. The subjects might as well be cattle or something. That's how above it they are. So what the subjects do don't, really implicate them, even they ostensibly share a religion. Yeah, so I think that's where the the pluralism comes from. Not because, they were believers in, pluralism. They were
they were not good. They were not model proto liberals. But I mean, important to point out is, by contrast, even amid this period marked by more religious orthodoxy and confessionalization in the East, Eastern empires remained much more pluralistic, even at their least pluralistic, than European polities that increasingly persecuted religious difference and heresy brutally.
Yes. Yeah, so that's true. And I think that's one of the reasons why Asia runs into trouble in the 19th century, because it's so much more pluralist in this period. And then, so the transition to the nation-state model is much more difficult, I think, which presumes a more homogeneous society to begin with, which Europe had created after, centuries of conflict. Yeah, so they were, I mean, the Ottomans, the Mughals, less so the Safavids, but they were ruling over very, as we would call in today's language, diverse societies. The majority of their subjects weren't Muslims. I mean, of course, the original, I mean, the Mongols, the Chingizids, they ruled over, all of Asia. So very, again, so they had to, they couldn't, they couldn't be too xenophobic or too much of a stickler about this and that. It wouldn't work. Whereas, in contrast, in the 16th century, we look at Europe and, it is actually certainly more porous, more open to influences from the East than it's been made out to be. I mean, European history is studied as if it was very self-contained, and Europeans never learned anything from anybody else, and they came up with everything themselves. I mean, that's the kind of the standard line. That's not true. I mean, in the book, I talk about the influences of these Asian orders in Europe, especially in the 16th century. So they were getting stuff, especially Italian merchants were going back and forth. There was also, competition between, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, especially, that was changing the way that they thought about stuff. But Europeans tend to be more hostile, more self-consciously hostile to ideas from, or like books or teachings that seem to come from outside of Europe. And we've talked about occult sciences and astrology. This has been studied, in European history because it was persecuted. And what we know now is actually this stuff was much more important to the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals and so on. It hasn't been really studied, but it was very important to the intellectual milieu. But it wasn't really persecuted. I mean, it was all, in contrast to Europe, all of that was, very accepted. And even after the turn to more like Sunni or Shia orthodoxy, there was considerable activity in these realms. So, yeah, different models.
Let's talk more about Europe during this period, because the 16th century is often thought of as the beginning of Europe's rise, but you emphasize that this rise was a relative one. Quote, "In the early modern period, European actors still depended on the East, not only for material goods, but also for ideas, especially in the realm of universal sovereignty and world empire." And this was particularly true for the Habsburgs. Quote, "Traditional narratives of the 16th century often observe that within it was the Habsburgs, and more than anyone, Charles V, who ruled from 1516 to 1556, as the Holy Roman Emperor, also Archduke of Austria, King of Spain, and Lord of the Netherlands. It was he who properly reintroduced notions of universal empire to the continental political landscape, with other European monarchs articulating their own visions in reaction to him. But without the Ottomans and their Chinggisid heritage, Charles V may not have been remembered for these innovations. Charles's competition with Suleiman I had a profound influence on him, thus also on the Habsburgs and the broader European trajectory of political development." That's really fascinating. How is the rise of the absolutist state in Europe conventionally understood, and why, as you argue, does that purported innovation in fact have Eastern and specifically Ottoman origins to be found even more particularly in the Habsburg rivalry and warfare with the Ottomans?
Yes. So this is the stuff that may get me in hot water. I don't know, but I thought I would be provocative and go for it. I think I'm on relatively safe ground. I mean, here's the issue. As I said before, European history is often studied as very self-contained, especially in my discipline, international relations, when we study history of international relations. It's often European history. And almost no mention is made of anything happening to the east of the Habsburgs in the 16th century. They are this, great house controlling much of, Europe, and then their competitors are, other European houses. But if you take a proper assessment of 16th century, none of the other, European houses were anywhere nearly as strong as the Habsburgs. They might not have, liked Habsburgs, but they didn't pose a real threat to them, especially in the first half of the 16th century. What you have instead is right to the eastern flank are the Ottomans, who are already at this point, as you explained before, they have a strong claim to being on their way to universal empire. And then, and to their east is are the Safavids, and there's this whole world beyond, right? So what makes more sense, that the Habsburgs were only concerned with other European houses because they could see into the future and they knew England was one day going to be like the British Empire and so on? Or does it make more sense from the vantage point of the 16th century that they were really preoccupied with the Ottomans, who were their main rival in Europe and also in the Mediterranean, North Africa, etc. So, and then, if your main rival is claiming to be a universal sovereign, a millennial sovereign, Lord of Conjunction, Lord of Time, the ultimate ruler at the end of days, I think that also affects the kind of claims that you're making, because, as I said, this language was transcultural. It wasn't specific to any religion. It was really cutting across. So in the same places that the Habsburgs are trying to rule over, as the Ottomans are claiming, Eastern Europe, etc.
And both sides thought that the apocalypse was coming.
Yeah, both sides thought the apocalypse was coming, the end of days, this marked by this conjunction. So I think it really, changes the language of, universal sovereignty on the Habsburg side. Of course, also on the Ottoman side. So the Ottomans were picking up stuff that Charles V, stuff he was doing, and they were, doing stuff in. Suleiman was, had this crown made. I discuss. That wasn't. There are a lot of, by the way, hats and crowns in this book, for those who are interested in kind of a side history of that he wouldn't have made had he not been worried about the claims of the Habsburgs. But so I'm arguing there's this resonance, they are in this competition, and that's changing the way that they are speaking the language of sovereignty. But arguably, more so on the Habsburg side, because again, what's happening there is unusual, right? You are suddenly having in a landscape where, you have elected monarchs and church, etc. Suddenly you have this person claiming to be at the center of it all, above it all, above the church even, right? Where is that coming from? That's sounding a little bit like Genghis sovereign to me. So I think, again, I'm not a proper historian, but I think one could be provocative and say he wouldn't have gone to these lengths if he didn't have the example of these other rulers to his east making these types of claims. And then, of course, that sets into motion a chain of events in European history where, you have other upstart houses reacting to the Habsburgs and making their own, arguments and these patterns of confessionalization and so on. So at least it's something to think about, I think, how European history would have gone if it was what it was imagined to be. If Europe was an island, never influenced by anybody else, I think European history would be very different.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Phenomenal World, a publication run out of the Jane Family Institute that puts out rigorous and clarifying research and writing to help you understand the complexities of the global political economy. Phenomenal World has featured many excellent dig guests like Tim Barker, Melinda Cooper, Femi Taiwo, Daniela Gabor, and Isabella Weber. If you're looking for deep analysis of things like the politics of monetary policy, the relationship between financial capital and development in the global south, how organized labor lost the construction industry, how the IMF is making it hard for poor countries to decarbonize, the way US dollar hegemony shapes global politics, and so much more, visit phenomenalworld.org and subscribe to get their original articles and their weekly newsletters of relevant research and writing. That's phenomenalworld.org. Head there to read and subscribe. I'm ad-libbing this into the ad, but so you know, it is a really good publication, and I will put a link in the show notes. At about the same time as the Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry, modern Russia was emerging from under the Golden Horde's rule. You write, quote, "The Jochids, unlike the Ilkhanate in Persia or the Yuan in China, did not eventually assimilate into the local culture, preferring to rule Russian towns from a distance, as vassals. This governance choice strengthened Muscovy over other principalities as they collected tribute and taxes in the name of the Khan." What role, then, did Jochid rule play, if any, in shaping Ivan III's brutal, and in the case of Ivan IV or Ivan the Terrible, extremely brutal rule? Because you write, quote, "Absolute power was not assumed to be natural in the Russian context. To the contrary, princes, boyars, and even the church, not to mention other cities such as Novgorod, had considerable independent authority in Russia at the time Ivan came to power. The idea that absolutism or autocracy comes naturally to Russians is as false as the idea that it comes naturally to Muslim societies." To what degree did Mongol heritage shape Tsarist Russia, and to what extent did the Rurik dynasty innovate a new and more brutal form of rule?
So this is in line with what I was saying earlier, how Islam had developed its own separation of religion and political rule before the Mongols came over, and so we associate Islamic rulers with autocracy, but actually that's an innovation that happens post. Well, autocracy is a loaded term. Let's say centralization is an innovation that happens post 13th, 14th, 15th century. So I'm making a similar argument about Russia, and obviously, there is this idea, often this argument often made about Russia that Russians love autocracy, or this is their natural state. But actually, if we look at the history, just as in any other geography, there are experiments in centralization, and then there are experiments in decentralization. So this is not in any way which one is going to have the upper hand. I don't think is predetermined. So what we're seeing in post Golden Horde is the influence of the Chinggisid model on Russian cities, especially Muscovy. And of course, this is a big debate in Russian historiography, the degree of influence, especially because there were long periods of silence. There was this idea of the Mongol yoke, and as we discussed with the Ming, once the Mongols had been the yoke had been thrown off, Muscovy is supposed to have become its own thing, example of Russian culture. But just as with the early Ming, we can see the influences of the Chinggisid sovereign model on Muscovy. So again, we see this centralized model, Ivan III, but then especially Ivan IV, claiming all this power in their person. And again, they are,
really to run a regime of terror through, I don't know how to pronounce it, Operachina?
Yeah. Yes. So this is exactly you say, this period of, there's no better way to describe it. It really is a reign of terror. Very modern in some ways. Yeah. So, but I mean, I'm not arguing that this period of this reign of terror, where like Ivan the Fourth like destroyed like enemies and sacked cities and this essentially created a state of exception that was necessarily like the Mongol influence. I think again there's like an amalgamation of different factors, but certainly like the centralization of authority in the Tsar. So there's like this rethinking of the Tsar. I mean, the Caesar. That word is from the Roman timeline, but the Khan. I mean, there's also like a degree of Khanness to this type of rule, and again, influences of also Christianity. I make the argument that certain xenophobic or repressive aspects of the rule in this period was more like Europe in that period and earlier periods rather than, or like European Christianity, rather than it was like the Asian model of, as we discussed before, like letting people be because you don't care, so it's a mix, and not a particularly good mix, I think, for the people living in that period. But you certainly can see the influences. So, I mean, one of my arguments in that chapter is in the 16th century, you have a globalizing world, which has in its core, not Europe, as it's usually assumed, but you have these West Asian empires from Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, Uzbeks, that are controlling a majority of the world's economy, a third of the world's population. This is really the core of the world order in the 16th century. And they have very strong Chinggizid influences, especially in the first half of the 16th century. You have the Ming, who have moved away from this Chinggizid model, but they are still not entirely not influenced. You have, the little khanates in Central Asia that are still operating with these notions. And then in Muscovy, you have another major house that's acting in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways like a Chinggizid house. And then, of course, in Europe, you have the Habsburgs who are getting influenced by this. So it's a different reading of 16th century rather than, a story of like European rise. I mean, Europe will rise later, but if the world had ended at the end of 16th century, it wouldn't, the story would have, would have been understood differently.
The post-Timurid empires that you write about were hit hard by a world order-shaking crisis known as the 17th century general crisis. Even though the Ottoman Empire lasts through World War I, Ottomans in the 16th and 17th century, and then later Turkish historians looking back, saw this period as the beginning of the end, a period of decline. And the Mughals likewise were consumed by declinist narratives. You write, quote, "Note that what is considered to be the root cause of decline by Eastern observers of their own polities, depersonalization of sovereignty, increased bureaucratization of the state, and so on, is precisely one of the explanations given for progress in European historiography. In Europe, far from being associated with decline, such developments have been hailed for ushering in an age of enlightenment and rational state behavior. How do we square these circles?" How do you square those circles? And then what was the 17th century general crisis, and why did it damage the 16th century world order, given that many of the particular polities not only endured, but went on to, in an objective sense, to continue to thrive?
So we've talked before about these periods of crisis punctuating the end of these world orders, as I've described them, causing fragmentation, 14th century, mid 15th century, and so on. But those were shorter periods of disruption, whereas there's a longer period lasting from the end of 16th century to the last quarter of the 17th century that some historians call the general crisis of the 17th century. And this was originally thought to be a European problem because, as many people know, the 17th century in Europe is particularly volatile. You have, again, these reactions to the Habsburgs, ending with, the 30 Years' War. You have civil wars elsewhere. But then, increasingly there's been a recognition that it wasn't, nobody was, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, was doing great. You have, time of troubles in Muscovy, succession crisis, essentially. You have rebellions in the Ottoman Empire, really severe, decades-lasting rebellions. And, you have the end of the Ming in China. So it seems to be this politically really volatile period. And again, what caused it? There have been different explanations. There have been political explanations, which don't seem nearly enough if we accept that these things were, caused by the same underlying, trends. It can't be like the politics of this place or that place. There have been financial explanations, the impact of, New World silver, the residual impact on world economy, etc. But lately, historians have been favoring climate change as an explanation because this was the peak period of what's known as the Little Ice Age, this period that lasts from around, 13th century to the 19th century to the Industrial Revolution. So I've already mentioned some argue that 13th century was wet, allowing Mongolian horses, and then world keeps getting colder, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, and 17th century is when it's supposed to have hit its peak, this period. So we know that the 17th century was at least 2 or 3 degrees Celsius colder. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. So it was colder, and there were all these weather events. And as a result, there were food shortages and all sorts of scarcity. And maybe this is what caused, the underlying unrest. Again, I don't have a strong argument as to what caused this period of crisis. What we know is that it was a prolonged period of political instability across Eurasia. And what I argue is that what this ended up doing is fragmenting the connections in this emerging 16th century global order that I described with its center in West Asia. It really disrupted trade, overland trade especially. And there may be an argument as to, maybe maritime connections being more advantageous as a result. But we do know overland trade was disrupted, maybe both because of climate reasons, but also because it became unsafe to go from point, because overland trade in Asia for, apart from these little periods of crisis, had been facilitated by the fact that Asia, compared to Europe, was always, apart from periods of conquest, was much more stable and safer and easier to move around. It took a long time, but you didn't have to worry too much about safety on the road. So that trade was disrupted, I think, as everywhere, was shaken by its own political issues. And then I think things like rebellions, or you could think of 30 Years' War as a kind of rebellion as well. Let's say rebellions in general, like dynastic, what leads to Ming being ousted as a kind of rebellion too. So rebellions all across, that forces everybody kind of to turn inward. And when you turn inward, again, your connections fray. So you're no longer competing, you're no longer trying to build a world empire or any kind of world order. I think there are lessons in that for our time. So the order phrase, and this is what's lost in the 17th century crisis, because then eventually there's material recovery. I mean, even for, we talk about, Europe's rise later, but even the Asian empires that I'm looking at, apart from there might have been dynastic change and so on, but if we take them as, states, they're doing okay. There's material expansion. The Qing, they expand. The Romanovs who replace, the Rurik, Russia. This is a period of expansion for Muscovy, Russia. What eventually becoming Russian Empire. Even the Ottomans in the 18th century are not doing badly. So where does this decline narrative come from, right? Because what ended up happening is in the 19th century, when Europe is really at the door of Asia as a result of industrial revolution and various military advantages. At the end of 19th century, when also this civilizational superiority narrative is coming from Europe, to some extent that's internalized, right, by Asian elites. They kind of accept this idea that they had been declining for centuries, and they set about, the new nationalist modernizers and so on, right, set about how do we fix this problem of centuries of decline. But materially, there wasn't really centuries of decline. What you have is maybe even deindustrialization that happens in 19th century. So you have relatively parallel stories, which flips, or the Great Divergence, as they call it, in the 19th century. So why did they believe it? I think they believed it. That brings me to your first question. They believed it because something was lost in the 17th century. And there were these debates, it was a period of crisis. There were these debates about, are we declining? So it seemed and what was lost is this, a particular kind of world order held together in these, by these shared notions of universal sovereignty and so on. And as they settled into another way of being, there were a lot of people writing, in the Ottoman Empire and so on, right? Writing, this is decline, the Sultan, is weak, but actually, in European history, that's considered a positive thing, because they're not operating with the same norms of what constitutes weakness and so on. So it's a lot of things come together to create this narrative of centuries of decline, when it's really decades of maybe being surpassed economically, materially.
As you've noted, each world order in your book ends thanks, at least in part, to what you call a structural crisis. Quote, underlying all of these general crises were structural pressures. The benefit of longue durée hindsight, coupled with a global vision, allows us to see that political turmoil during these crises and during the ensuing fragmentation of the existing order was not really caused by specific great house rivalries or power transition, i.e. the things IR worries most about as being corrosive to order, but rather structural dynamics such as climate change, epidemics, demographic decline, monetary problems, and so on, i.e. the things IR has not worried at all about until recently. Why, by contrast, do you argue that rivalries are in fact constitutive of order and constitutive of what you call the ecumene underlying any given order, rather than a threat to that order? And why does a world order's reproduction rely on an ecumene?
Yeah. So by ecumene, I mean the shared norms that connect successive world orders. So in our modern international order, we could say we're in the post-Cold War order, or sometimes called the liberal international order, or maybe we're even out of that, we're in the next whatever, doesn't have a name, but that's still connected to the Cold War order, and before the Cold War order we had the European concert system, and so they are linked to each other in recognizable ways because they share certain norms about their understanding of sovereignty, which is linked to territoriality, linked to, national self-determination, even if it's, violated in practice. There are these ideas of what justifies sovereignty. or how a great power acts, it's there. As the orders change, there is still a continuity that's organizing them, normative continuity, and making them somewhat similar to each other, or at least overlapping in recognizable ways. So I was arguing, by studying Asian Eastern world orders, it helps us realize that, what we think orders are undermined by rivalry, great power rivalry, but actually great power rivalry can help reinforce deep norms. So it may be actually constitutive of order. I mean, the clear example of that is, again, Cold War. You have the US and the Soviet Union, and they are great rivals, right? They have different ideologies. But at the same time, what they agree on reinforces that deep norm. They agree on the fact that, great powers are at least officially not empires. They agree that great powers have like spheres of influence. They agree on, at least...
They agree that material progress is the sign of a great power, thus the kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev.
Exactly. Or, the arms race. And, so there's a lot that they agree on, as they seem to disagree on a lot. And I think maybe it's Bourdieu, I'm not sure, who said like the greatest orthodoxy is like is created by a seeming like binary. So something like that is, what I had in mind. So, in my world orders, you have these, great houses. They seem to be competing, like the Mughals, the Safavids, the Ottomans, even the Habsburg and so on. But to the extent that they agree, like, the end of the world, like, we're looking at, the end of the world, and we are competing to be millennial sovereigns. They are producing a particular type of order of shared norms and so on. So, and I think international relations has overlooked that, how you don't have to, agreement doesn't always have to be explicit. And often, like, rivalry is made possible by being very similar in a lot of ways. Otherwise, you're not really, you can't really compete. If you're very, very different in how you do things, then you wouldn't be competing.
There's a tacit but very powerful agreement on premises.
Yes, exactly.
That are naturalized and normalized and assumed to not be, contingent at all.
Yes. You can see it in anything. In American politics, until recently, there was a lot of that between the two major parties. Maybe there still is, but maybe that's breaking down. And that's, that created a certain kind of mainstream kind of understanding of, like, the American political landscape. So it's no different when we're talking about world order creation and reproduction, I think. So what really disrupts, I think, order is not that. It's not rivalry. It's what really disrupts order are things beyond, our choices and agency in a way, and things that fragment those connections, whether the connections are rivalry or cooperation. When you're not engaging at all, that's what disrupts order. So when these competing houses turn inwards, for whatever the reason, then order fragments. And then, if it can be reconstituted relatively quickly, then the people who reconstituted are likely to be like those who were the previous orders. But then if it's not reconstituted for a long time, as it happened arguably in the 17th century, then, new actors can take over and create their version of order. I think that's kind of the story I'm getting at.
You write, quote, if the material gap between Europe and Asia, or Eurasia, before the second half of the 19th century has thus been retroactively exaggerated, why did Eastern elites so easily fold ontologically in especially the second half of the 19th century, when faced with narratives of European civilizational superiority. To put it another way, why were they so easily stigmatized by Western actors? Why did they internalize the Western civilizational schema which found them inferior, even as they challenged their own country's particular placement within that schema? In other words, we take the East's developmental inferiority complex for granted, but we should not do so because it began to take shape well before the Industrial Revolution decisively put Europe ahead of Asia in material terms. How then did these two declinists' narratives about the East, European and Eastern, quote, seem to corroborate each other? And what impact did that corroboration have?
Yes, thank you. So this discussion comes out of my first book, in a way, which was called After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West. And then that book focused on 19th and 20th century, and I was looking at essentially Turkey after Ottoman Empire, Japan after World War II, and Russia after the Cold War, and how Eastern powers were incorporated into the modern international order. And, what you find is like this common thread starting in 19th century of what I call stigmatization. So Europe is saying we are a superior civilization and you're backward. And there seems to be, the elites in these settings don't like this, obviously, but they seem to agree that there is a civilizational hierarchy. And they often, challenge, we're not at this rung of the ladder, but we're here, or, we're actually Europeans or something, right? So there is internalization of these social hierarchies as they are being spouted by Europeans at the end of 19th century, which of course is particularly racist and a problematic period in European thinking as well. But after I finished that book, it became kind of a puzzle for me in my own mind. I knew that this was a commonly shared reaction across Asia, internalizing the stigma of civilizational decline and backwardness. And it was part of modernizing narratives everywhere. But then I thought, well, why should it be so? Because if it's true that, Asia was for the first time connected by Europeans into one international order, right? Because that's the story we tell. Asia was regionalized, all Asian activity is regional activity, and it's only Europe and the West that links Asia with the global order. If that's the case, why should they have this almost uniform reaction? They should have much more varied reactions across the continent. So I thought, well, what explains the similarity? Why are these stories similar? And that's what got me thinking about this book project, wanting to explain the similarities across Asia that I thought were unexplained, and then I ended up going all the way back to the 13th century. But to come back to your question, what's happening, I think, is, as I said, in the 19th century, there is this crisis of confidence, and then, in order to explain it, there's kind of a latching onto existing narratives of decline, and often, the existing narratives of decline are to be found in the 17th century, even though there's a period of recovery, material recovery in the middle. So then, that those older narratives of decline are put back into circulation. This certainly happened in the Ottoman Empire. A lot of this stuff was printed. The debates in the 17th century. The Sultan is weak. He's being led by the women in the court or whatever. That's that sort of. So, and then that becomes. That seems to corroborate what the Europeans are saying about this. There having been centuries of decline, even though what what the 17th century observers are bemoaning as causes of decline are the same things that in European history are held to be, positive steps in the development of, rational state, weakening of the power of the absolutist court. So yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, readers will have to look at the book. It's a bit of a convoluted story, but I think one that's very interesting. And again, there are lessons for present day there as well.
So the crisis of confidence precedes the Industrial Revolution, and yet the decisive economic shift after the Industrial Revolution did have a major impact. It deindustrialized and economically subjugated the East within this new capitalist world system. What does your assessment emphasizing the centrality of ecumenical decline make of the role played by this raw materiality of Western power unleashed by industrialization and capitalist takeoff?
I mean, capitalism is a big part of the story of why the story ends the way it did. But I do open the book with this counterfactual, as you saw. Like, what if what if history had ended in a different way? Like, what if Japan had industrial revolution and then it was it was East Asia that took off, where if that became the developments that we associate with Western Europe with industrial capitalism. Like, what if that happened in Asia? So I think that's really, like, for me, well, capitalism, but really industrial capitalism is really what changes the end of the story. I'm sympathetic to what's called the California school, that it could have happened not in Europe, but somewhere else. I mean, there is a contingency to where it happened. I mean, there were certainly specific circumstances in Europe that made it possible, like especially post the discovery of Americas and so on. So, I mean, I suppose to answer your question, I mean, in the book, I mean, this book is about order making and about ideas, about particular models, like sovereignty models, what I call ecumene, like these deep norms that connect successive orders and so on. But in terms of like turning points, I do emphasize what I call like structural pressures and also like materiality, like, so whether that's industrial capitalism or industrial revolution and so on, all of that stuff is very important to my narrative. At the same time, like how their impact and how people react to those developments have to do with the kind of ideas and norms that they're operating in. So the two are connected. And even though I emphasize more like what's happening in the realm of ideas, I'm not at all discounting what's happening in the realm of the economy and other realms of materiality.
Along those lines, how do you differentiate a world order from what Marxist world systems theorists, and there are, as you note in your book, diverse and divergent, sets of scholars here, that world systems theorists have called the world system? How does a world order compare to a world system, or are they synonymous?
I mean, they are similar. I think world systems theorists have done some of the best work in terms of, pointing to the parts of global history we've forgotten about. I mean, not so much Wallerstein. I think he was a bit too Eurocentric, but others have. I mean, they've been writing for like decades on how connected the world has been, and it's all there. So, I mean, due respect, I'm not. In some ways, I'm telling the same story, but emphasizing different aspects of it. So, I'm more interested in these, because what I'm really interested in as a theorist is, sovereignty and order and. The ideas people have about sovereignty and order, these patterns of centralization and decentralization and so on. So I'm emphasizing those aspects of it. But of course, underlying all of that are economic relations as well. So I suppose I'm more on the Weberian side of the equation, but I also very much respect what what they have done.
You argue that the reigning great power hegemon, that being the United States, is not key to the perpetuation of the present world order. What would it mean then to pass from this world order to another one?
Yeah, and I mean, it has to do with these, deep norms that organize the way we think about world politics, and this is why, you opened with the question of like, what do we learn from this history of Asia? And I said, we forgot this history. If we forget this history, like, what does that mean? Like, we can't even imagine forgetting like this Western-centered international order. But I mean, to move to a truly new world order, I think would require an ecumenical shift, right? A different way of organizing sovereignty, the world being centered elsewhere other than the West. I mean, what I was trying to say to my fellow IR scholars is, the debate is often, China is rising. China, when China is, surpasses the US, it's a post-Western world. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, we have, as again, to use a domestic analogy, we have situations where women or minorities come to positions of power, and it doesn't really change the underlying organization of the order, right? It, like, the norms remain in place. It may weaken those norms, but
it may strengthen the norms sometimes.
It may strengthen them, by creating a certain backlash or, yeah. So, truly post-Western, post-Westphalian world, I think, requires something like what happened to my world orders. They fragmented, and then something else arose in their place, and then they were almost erased from history. And it's possible, we could be looking at another century of general crisis. Again, all of the factors, we've discussed are seemingly at play. There's increased fragmentation in our order. Increasingly, everybody's turning more inward. Yeah, so that sounds like a recipe for order fragmentation to me. Then maybe, I don't want to sound like I'm necessarily wishing for this, but it is possible that, we may be nearing the end of this particular ecumene.
Yeah, you just said that you're not necessarily looking forward to this. It's just something that's happening, perhaps. And you note that the normalization of Asian decline narratives have not only been imposed from the West, but also, or from the East prior to actual objective decline, but also by nationalist post-colonial successor states. And you write that today it is, quote, not only mainstream IR that is constrained in its imagination of a post-Western future. Critical scholars of especially decolonial sensibilities may think they know what such a future looks like because they often advocate for it. However, they are also working with ahistorical assumptions. How do critics of Western domination mirror its champions in their demonization of the West and idealization, romanticization of the non-West? And what sort of consequences does that have? How does that cloud our thinking about how to move forward in these extremely uncertain times?
The traditional, like the Whiggish version of history was, about, Europe bringing civilization to the rest of the world, I suppose. And then now, increasingly there's been, criticism after criticism, and the historians we work with are Eurocentric, but often, that turns into saying, everything is the West's fault or Europeans' fault. And I think both kind of center the West or Europeans in history. And to truly move beyond Eurocentrism, I think we need to realize not everything has to do with with Europe or the West, and there are, good and bad actors in Asia as well. I mean, my book is a story of empire building. I'm not advocating for it. It's not like, Europeans had empires and how great, and like Asians also had empires, how great. It's not that, it's, they were also like very brutal. I mean, in some similar ways and some different ways. But the empires did facilitate, exchange and so on. So, and they created shared histories. So that's not like an empire apology. It's like, a fact you can see. So, I think also, we are all, another thing that I'm trying to convey in the book, we're all shaped by our experiences, whether we like them or not, whether we embrace them or not. And our world has been shaped by the West for a century and more. So this idea that, if Western domination ends, like authentic Eastern civilizations will reemerge or something, I think that's, or like idealization of the East or like the non-West, because there's not, these are not, everything is relational, like, right, there isn't like a pure East waiting to be rescued or to emerge from like the shadows. Like, it's part of the same 100-year-old, 200-year history. And there are a lot of things, I think, that have to do with problems of the nation state that, at least in Asia, like, people were headed that way anyway. I don't think it really took Europeans to push them in that direction. To make a long story short, world politics, it's complicated, and there are good and bad actors everywhere, and also depends on your perspective, like, right, who you think is a good and bad actor is. So I don't think we should, I agree, like, at least in my discipline, international relations, the history has been very Eurocentric, but the solution to that is not to say, just to say that. I think we need to develop, which is what I was trying to do in this book, alternative histories that both decenter the West, but at the same time don't idealize non-Western actors, like restore their agency without, this simplistic idea that they must have been great just because they were not Western or European.
Yeah, I would not be eager to live under Genghis Khan's rule. Where commoners were treated no better than cattle.
If you survived the conquest, then it wasn't so bad.
Well, Ayşe Zarakol, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. This has been a great pleasure, truly.
Ayşe Zarakol is a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at Emmanuel College. She's the author of After Defeat: How the East Learned to Live with the West, and her new book that we discussed today, Before the West: The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that there is something in human history like retribution, and it is a rule of historical retribution that its instrument be forged not by the offended, but by the offender himself. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel, Gemma Sack, and Mariel Solomon. Our senior advisor is Theorio Francos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it is on iTunes or wherever, please also rate and review us nicely. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling other people about the show. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.